Unilever's profound belief that purpose and sustainability are a pathway to better financial performance. There is no trade-off. And we're already seeing that money that gets invested in green stimulus seems to generate a better ROI than the more broad stimulus packages. So it's the most important mindset to break, is that there's a trade-off between a green recovery and an economic prosperity.
In 2020, we saw at BlackRock more than a doubling of investments towards climate change. And the inquiry we're having from U.S. companies, U.S. foundations, globally, we're seeing a change. So we were beginning to see the tsunami of change already from the private sector. And now with the potential of having a Biden administration, I think we're going to need the government to come along and help us on this journey.
Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney has shifted his focus from monetary policy to climate policy. He's working with the UK government and the United Nations on climate action and finance. Carney told Bloomberg's Alex Steele there's no time to waste in this effort.
We need to invest now. I mean, we're touch wood, we're going to be coming out of the health and economic crisis. The question is, what direction are we pointing our economies? We're going to point towards sustainable growth. Huge investment. You rightly started with that, Alex. Huge numbers for investment that's capital intensive. It's job heavy. Having that information now so companies and investors can put money to work is critical.
So what role then does policy play in that? We just had an election, obviously, here in the U.S. What's the role of public policy?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple roles. One, and I wouldn't understate this first bit, is set the direction. So one of the planks of President-elect Biden's platform was the U.S. is going to move to 100% clean energy and net zero by 2050. So you set the direction. Secondly, you put in place the frameworks that are necessary, that information for investors to make the decision. And you also have credible regulatory policy. So you're showing the direction of the economy. More hydrogen, zero emission vehicles, moving towards electrifying more of the economy and moving the electricity sector and generation towards renewables. All of those things send signals to investors, provide the information as well, and gets money moving. So that's what government has to start with, the objective, fill in with the framing, and then candidly get out of the way so the private sector figures out where to go.
Investors around the world are demanding green investments. But what exactly does green mean? Guggenheim's Scott Minerd addressed this issue from an investor's perspective.
Very little time is being spent on trying to set economic incentives. Until the private sector has economic incentives to get there, the reality is that everybody will continue to act in what they think is their best interest. And right now, a great organization like HSBC, who's made a huge commitment and is way ahead of the curve, can be negatively impacted if they move too aggressively when other people decide they're going to take advantage of the fact that HSBC has changed their policies.
So do you think that this is something that needs harmonization, like in a way that we bring more groups together to sort of set targets? Is this a policymaker's question? Like, who's going to be the prime mover on making this come together in a way that's beneficial for everyone?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I think the policymakers need to look at this and understand that there are incentives that can be put in place which basically don't cost anything for the governments. But two, I think the investment community in the broad sense should be getting together and discussing this issue to try to be develop a uniform standard about a baseline for what the objectives are, what the definitions are, and what the rules of the road are.
The Bloomberg New Economy Forum also featured sessions on infectious disease research, public health, and the progress of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. A conversation with Bill Gates touched on several of these critical issues, including the prospects for eliminating, not just controlling, the coronavirus.
We don't know enough yet to say, can we do the elimination of this? That would be the best, because then zero is magical, because it just doesn't spread at all. It doesn't come back. I think there's a good chance we can do that, But we'll have to look at the vaccines, how good they are at blocking transmission. Because this is a super spreader disease, it is likely we can do that. Otherwise, we'll have to maintain immunity on an indefinite basis, which probably means booster shots. And a little bit, as people come into the country, do they have a digital certificate that says whether they've been vaccinated or not, which that's fairly complex and will need for a period of time, like we've tried to do with yellow fever. But as the U.S. rejoins the WHO, this idea of what does the vaccine certificate look like, hopefully that dialogue will begin.
Visit Bloomberg.com to see much more from the 2020 New Economy Forum. Bloomberg subscribers can access NEF Go on a terminal for complete coverage. I'm Scarlett Fu. Carol, back to you.
Thanks, Scarlett. And thanks to all the participants who made the Bloomberg New Economy Forum a success. As the world continues to battle the pandemic, we hope it will help inspire the practical solutions and innovative actions needed for an inclusive, sustainable economic recovery. I'm Carol Masser. Stay safe, everyone. This is Bloomberg.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
Yelp is the go-to site for raves, rants, and recommendations. Since its launch in 2004, chances are, if it's a business down the street from you, it's got a Yelp page. But the coronavirus pandemic dealt a devastating blow as thousands of businesses across the country were forced to shut down. Yelp laid off 1,000 of its own employees. Now, with a vaccine in sight, but virus uncertainty still ahead, Yelp serves as a sort of mirror to the health of American business. Still, it's not COVID that CEO Jeremy Stoppelman is most worried about. It's the growing shadow of Google. In this edition of Bloomberg Studio 1.0, Yelp co-founder and CEO Jeremy Stoppelman.
Take me back to March 2020. The pandemic hits and the lights go out, literally, at thousands of small businesses across the United States. As the person who runs the most prominent platform for small businesses in the country, what was that moment like for you?
Probably the best word is terror. It was a scary moment, I think, obviously for America, for small businesses, and especially for Yelp, because we're a way to find great local businesses. And, the first thing crossing my mind is, are people going to still buy advertising? Like, are all businesses going to be affected or just a portion? We had gone through I was CEO in 2008 when we had that major recession. And so I knew that Yelp as a company should be resilient, but I had never faced anything remotely like a pandemic where every business is potentially affected by shutdown. So it was a very scary moment for me and for the company.
Did reviews come to a standstill? Did advertising stop?
We certainly took a pretty big hit in advertising dollars as people paused their campaigns. Fortunately, we had functionality that allowed them to set a future date. And so we encouraged people to, set a resume date for their advertising months later, perhaps as the pandemic had passed, or at least when the panic would have subsided. Our focus at Yelp was really getting employees ready to work from home, getting people out of offices. This is all, kind of late February. It hit our radar as, hey, this is coming. We need to get, salespeople at home. All of our salespeople have desktop computers in an office. Like, how do we get them equipped to try and work out of their home and, keep the company running? And so there was a lot of operational challenges transitioning people to work from home and getting ready to try and adapt to this extreme crisis.
So fast forward to fall, Yelp shares spike 20% on news of the early success of the Pfizer vaccine. And if everything works out, that could mean the economy opens faster. That's good for small businesses. That's good for Yelp. How optimistic are you?
None of us have been through a pandemic before, so we can't know everything. But, I can't say that in the last quarter, things really had come back. Economic activity had picked up. We were seeing people starting to dine at restaurants. Obviously, with the better weather, we weren't quite into winter yet. People were returning to restaurants. Home and local services, as people spent more time at home, really has held up throughout the pandemic. We've really come back in a big way, faster than even we were hoping for. And with the vaccine potentially arriving and starting to get out there, I think we can finally say, hey, there is light at the end of this tunnel. That's been the scariest thing about the whole crisis is we had hoped that a vaccine would arrive, but actually knowing that one is there and that it's actually 90% effective, I think is very exciting. Certainly for us at Yelp, hopefully for lots of in the minds of small business owners and the rest of the world is very happy, I think, to hear that news.
So what are you expecting to see over the holidays, given that we're going into winter, cold and flu season, a potential spike in COVID cases? We're already seeing hospitalization surge, and we know that people aren't going to be traveling and out there shopping and eating out like they normally would.
I mean, it's hard. I'm not currently contemplating national shutdowns where everyone is frozen in place like they were, kind of the March, April timeframe. I think people will have to be cautious, in restaurant dining will probably be curtailed or very limited depending on the situation in that particular region. But I think again for Yelp's business, a lot of it is buoyed by the home and local sector, which has done really well. As people are home, things happen. Your roof leaks, you got to get that fixed. Your toilet clogs. Well, your whole family is, your kids are possibly doing their remote schooling there. You got to get that thing fixed. And so those service providers will continue to do well and will continue to spend to acquire leads from sites like Yelp.
Now, you regularly release these economic impact reports, and from what I can tell, by the end of summer, you found that 160,000 businesses had closed on Yelp. Where does that number stand now? What are businesses telling you about how they're doing region to region?
We have seen, lots of businesses reopen that were temporarily closed. I think the number is around 220,000 of the temporarily closed businesses have opened back up again, which is a great sign. And also from a new business standpoint, especially in the restaurant and food sector, we're seeing new business openings at levels that are in line with 2019. So, that's one really inspiring thing showing kind of the resilience of American entrepreneurship is that businesses are, new entrepreneurs are still being born in this environment, which is incredible. I think it just shows incredible tenacity and bodes well for the economy as we start thinking about 2021 and beyond.
Now, early on in the pandemic, Yelp laid off 1,000 people. You furloughed a bit more than that. where does staffing stand now?
At the start of the pandemic, obviously, we saw advertising revenue dropping very rapidly. We had to make some very tough calls around our people, people that were incredible employees for us, and it was a very difficult moment. We had to lay off 1,000 people, as you mentioned. We also furloughed about 1,000 people as well. And that set us into that put us into a stable position to ride out sort of the immediate impact of the pandemic and whatever economic damage would result. And 4 months later, we were actually in a position to be able to bring back extend offers back to almost all of the furloughed employees. And so that was a great feeling. Obviously, it's very tough, to let anybody go. But we had made a commitment to these furloughed employees, and so it was great to see so many of them back working at Yelp, and many of which are here today.
Now, the pandemic, as you alluded to, has become very, very political, and I'm wondering what your take is on Joe Biden's election. Are you at all concerned that his safety-first approach could, mean the economy opens more slowly?
I think we have to be guided by science. We have to take a dispassionate look. We have to take politics out of it and say, we can't really have a great economy if everyone's cowering, from impacts of the pandemic or hospitals are getting overloaded with cases. So we just have to take a sensible approach. We have to listen to the scientists. If they're telling us that, wearing masks is going to, diminish the impact of the pandemic, then we should all be wearing masks. It's very straightforward. It shouldn't be a political issue. It's very frustrating that it has been. And I think that costs us valuable time and, even more importantly, costs us health and even lives.
It seems like the next stimulus package might be more scaled back. Are you concerned about a divided government, meaning that small businesses aren't going to get the help they need?
I think the Fed chair has been pretty clear that, businesses need support, especially small businesses need support. And I think the initial stimulus package was a positive. And, we've been all waiting and hoping for another one. And I think, we shouldn't just have socialism for big companies where they can borrow endlessly with cheap debt from the, powered by the Fed. We should extend the helping hand to all these great small business owners that are just trying to get by. An assistant of mine, broke into a meeting and tapped me on the shoulder and literally slipped me a Post-it note that said Steve Jobs is on the line.
We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
It is possible we could have negative growth if this resurgence gets bad enough and mobility falls off enough.
We knew that things were going to slow down after the bounce back in the third quarter, and you're seeing that in the data now.
We're going to be well into 2021 before there's some sort of equilibrium that we achieve.
We could spend a lot of time talking about old stories. You've been in Silicon Valley a long time. You were part of the early PayPal team. But there's one old story that I really do want to ask you about, which is that Google tried to buy Yelp back in 2009 for over $500 million, and you turned them down. Explain how that played out.
Well, I think that Yelp was doing something really positive, which was, growing quickly, gathering all this useful information about local businesses that, frankly, no other site had. And I think Google saw that Maps was of growing importance to them and was interested in Yelp. And we initially had a partnership. But ultimately, I think, Google wasn't satisfied with that partnership and wanted to get into the business themselves. And so then, there was a back and forth where they had some interest in Yelp. But ultimately, it didn't work out. I think we saw things differently. And I think that was good. It allowed Yelp to stay independent and to grow on its own. And frankly, I think I've been able to develop as a CEO quite a bit as well. So I think it's been good for me personally.
Now, as the story goes, Steve Jobs, who was obviously running Apple at the time, Google's biggest competitor, called you to convince you to turn it down. Did that really happen?
It did. Yeah, it was a bit of a surreal moment. I'd call it probably a career highlight, still a peak highlight for me. When an assistant of mine, broke into a meeting and tapped me on the shoulder and literally slipped me a Post-it note that said Steve Jobs is on the line. And so I ran out of the meeting and then, picked up the phone. And of course, it wasn't Steve Jobs. It was Steve Jobs' assistant was on the line. And so then I was waiting for Steve Jobs, who did ultimately get on the phone. And he had some not so nice things to say about Google and some nice things to say about Yelp, and said, he loved Yelp and that we should keep going. And if it was a money thing, then we should be talking to Apple, not Google, but we should just keep doing what we're doing. And, I thought that was good advice.
So fast forward to today, Yelp is now a $2 billion public company, but also Google is now your biggest competitor. Did you make the right call?
Well, I think I did. I think Yelp continues to serve on its mission, which is connecting people with great local businesses. And it's been a really rewarding journey. And I think lots of people find Yelp still incredibly valuable. I think, over 100 million people come to Yelp every single month and steer themselves to a great local business. So I think it's going well.
So the Department of Justice has recently sued Google over antitrust. Taking on Google, competing against Google is no joke for any business. What was your reaction to the suit?
We've been working on this topic for a very long time, so there was a good feeling, I would say, in the Yelp office, because we've been kind of shouting from the rooftops for a very long time that there is a monopoly problem in this country, and in particular, there is a Google problem in this country, and Google has behaved illegally, and has leveraged its monopoly in ways that are destructive to innovation and competition, and bad. It's bad for consumers, bad for small business owners, and so it was great to see some early validation of that from the DOJ.
Now we've all seen the increasing number of Google reviews, and Yelp's main complaint that Google favors its own reviews over yours isn't actually the core of the case. Are you at all concerned that your concerns might get passed over?
I mean, it's hard to say where the case goes right now because the state AGs will be, sort of bringing their own cases, and presumably it gets consolidated. So it's hard to know the exact scope of the case. I think, the early signs that, from our perspective are positive. And, again, there's bipartisan support for really scrutinizing Google and taking a look at their behavior over the last decade. You look at television over the last 40, 50 years, it was a highly regulated industry. You look at radio, highly regulated. Even going back to movies, there were antitrust cases that made a big difference in the distribution of films. And so why is it that technology should be completely immune to that, especially these new, sort of the Google generation of technology companies? Why shouldn't, Congress exercise its power? Why shouldn't the DOJ investigate? Why shouldn't the FTC investigate?
You told 60 Minutes back in 2018, if I were starting out today, I would have no shot of building Yelp. That opportunity has been closed off by Google and their approach. If you provide great content in one of these categories that's lucrative to Google and seen as potentially threatening, they will snuff you out. They will make you disappear. They will bury you. Has Google continued to try to bury Yelp since that time?
I mean, it's an easy thing to test for yourself. You could just, do essentially any search with local intent and then see how far down the page you have to go to get to any kind of organic result, especially in a category that's particularly lucrative from a SMB advertising standpoint. I mean, they've really tried to maximize the revenue, and in doing so have put the consumer in the back seat. And I think that's a real problem. But then also it stifles innovation, because if it's basically there's no organic content anymore, there isn't really that incentive for creators to try and create new and interesting websites, collect information from users. I think it's quite sad. And I think if you talk to the venture capital community, you'll hear that as well. There just isn't as much interest in ideas that are powered by search engine optimization, where you create really wonderful content and then Google or other search engines drive you traffic. Like, it's just Google now, and if it's a lucrative vertical, they're going to try and suck up all the revenue.
Now, President-elect Biden hasn't detailed his thoughts on antitrust yet, but we know that the Obama administration was fairly close to Silicon Valley, and Google in particular. How would you like Biden to weigh in on antitrust? What do you want lawmakers to do? Should Google be broken up?
Yeah, I think all we can ask for is independent thought. And so you're absolutely right that unfortunately the Obama administration has a very bad record when it comes to antitrust enforcement, and especially Google scrutiny. I think Google's lobbyist was the #1 lobbyist in the White House by visits. And so that's been widely reported. And even as the FTC was purportedly investigating, there was seemingly back-channel communication with Google, which is very sad to learn of. And so I would hope, and I think there's some indication, that Biden is going to take a more independent view of this. And I think we'll have to see who's involved in the administration, who's in the cabinet, who are the people around Biden. My personal thought is, like, somehow we have to get Elizabeth Warren in there, because she's been particularly strong on, hammering home the point that monopolies are not good for the economy. They're not good for innovation. They're not good for consumers. And so we need someone like that with a really strong message and a strong independence streak as well.
Now, all of that said, some businesses have complained that Yelp reviews skew more negative. How do you respond to, this complaint from businesses who, might prefer Google because they see that they have more positive reviews there?
We try to be, the most independent, create a level playing field for businesses. And, that frustrates businesses that, frankly, on other platforms are used to getting what they want, which is, being able to ask their friends to write reviews for them, being 5 stars. And in fact, the data supports that. So the FTC, an economist there, recently put out a paper that talked about the review distribution on the various platforms. And Yelp actually has the most balanced review system, which is very validating. That feels great to me, because that's what we're trying to achieve, is just a mirror of the real world.
If you are a woman or a person of color in Silicon Valley these days, what's your advice?
These are talented people. They do have a lot of options, so make sure you choose an option that supports you and makes you feel valued.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen.
And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
You're an engineer, you worked at X.com, back in the day, the online bank that was started by Elon Musk, which merged with PayPal. What are some of the biggest lessons you've taken from that time in your life and those people who I imagine are still in your life today?
One of the big takeaways from PayPal was just how much you could do even if you had no experience. And so I joined X.com, which eventually merged with PayPal when I was 22, I think. And very quickly, I became an engineering manager, maybe a year and a half later, 2 years later, and then ultimately rose into the executive ranks there on the engineering side. And thinking about it, it was kind of preposterous that those folks would give me so much responsibility so early in my career. But the fact that we somehow pulled it off and created a successful consumer brand and payment site that ended up being really critical to eBay, and then ultimately now as a payment service that so many of us use, I think validates that it's not all about experience. A lot of it is great determination, creativity, innovation, all of those good things. And so I've tried to bring that with me to Yelp.